Okay, hello and welcome. This lecture is a summary of the hypothesis test for the two population situation. When we do hypothesis testing for the two population situation, we look at the differences between two population means, or two population proportions, or two population variances. Now, first of all, if we are looking at the difference between two population means, we distinguish between independent samples and dependent samples. If the samples are independent, we look at the small sample situation and the large sample situation. Now on this slide, we have the small sample situation, and you can see here for the assumptions that we have independent samples, two small samples from normal populations, and in the first case, if we can assume that the population variances are equal, then our test statistic is given by this formula over here. And the test statistic follows the t-distribution with degrees of freedom equal to the sum of the sample sizes minus 2. So that just means that if we want to get the critical values for our rejection region, we make use of the t-distribution. Or if we want to calculate the p-value, then we will calculate the p-value from the t-distribution. And here we just have the pooled variance. We have to calculate the pooled variance because we need that to substitute it into our test statistic formula. Okay, the other case is then, of course, where we cannot assume equal population variances. Then my test statistic is given by this formula. It also follows a t-distribution, but the degrees of freedom is now given by this formula. Still within the independent sample situation, if we are working with large independent samples, then our test statistic is this one here, and it follows approximate standard normal distribution. So again, to get your critical values for your rejection regions or to calculate your p-value, you will make use of the standard normal distribution. Okay, and then the other situation is when we are working with dependent samples. Now, when we are working with dependent samples, we will calculate the difference between the observations in the first sample and the second sample. That variable is variable D. And then we work with the differences in our hypothesis test. So the test statistic is then given by the mean of the sample mean of the differences over the standard deviation of the differences divided by the square root of the sample size. So the sample size is the number of differences or the number of pairs. We distinguish between the large sample situation and the small sample situation. If we are working with the large sample situation, so we have many differences or many pairs, then the test statistic follows an approximate standard normal distribution. And if we are working with the small sample situation, we have to assume that the differences come from a normal population. Then we work with the same formula for the test statistic, but the difference comes in that this test statistic now follows the t-distribution with degrees of freedom sample size minus 1. Okay, and we also looked at the difference between two population proportions. Our assumptions are independent samples and we are working with large samples. Then our test statistic is this formula here, and we need to calculate the pooled proportion so that we can substitute it into our test statistic, and our test statistic follows the approximate standard normal distribution. And then the last situation was when we are looking at two population variances. Then our test statistic is the ratio of the first sample variance over the second sample variance, and that test statistic follows the F distribution. And the first degree of freedom for this F distribution is sample size 1 minus 1. And the second degree of freedom is sample size 2 minus 1. So that just means that if we want to find the critical values for the rejection region, we will make use of the F distribution. Or if we use the p-value method, we will calculate the p-value from the F distribution. Okay, so I hope you found this useful and that you can use this summary as a reference in the future.